Hello, my name is Michael Albert. I'm the host of the podcast titled Revolution Z. This podcast is episode 19 of our sequence. It's one that's about vision. The title is Disputing Participatory Socialism 3. To prepare you, I should say at the outset that I'm pretty sure it is the longest to date. Why is it so long? It's because this episode is a kind of exchange between myself and Noam Chomsky, wherein I address Chomsky's views about social vision as expressed in a long interview he did many years back. And it is because in addressing his views, I want to be as true as possible to what he had to say. This is because so much of it is so insightful, but it's also because I want to accurately convey the part that implicitly takes issue with participatory economics and, in turn, offer an ample response. So, to get to it. Way back in 1976, looking to me at least a little bit by Buddy Holly, Noam Chomsky gave Peter Jay what I think may be his most extensive interview ever regarding what a desirable society might look like. I believe the views he offered are still dear to him, as well as to many other anarchists, and they are dear to me as well. Indeed, they have influenced my own commitments, including the vision central to Revolution Z, albeit with some important refinements. Refinements, that is, because it turns out that some of the then-young Chomsky's views were, I think, incorrect, as well as contrary to certain facets of the participatory vision we have been exploring. So we can look at Chomsky's views at that time not only for their insights, but also as a source of another round of concerns about our participatory approach by a very, very smart anti-capitalist, and also, by extension, by many other very smart anarchists who have similar concerns. Chomsky offered his observations as part of the heritage of what he labeled libertarian socialist or anarcho-syndicalist or communist anarchist views. He was following, he said, in the tradition of Bakunin and Kropotkin and Anton Pannekoek, in favoring, he said, a society organized on the basis of organic units, organic communities. Chomsky added that he meant that the workplace and the neighborhood are central. More, from those two basic units, there could derive, through federal arrangements, a highly integrated kind of social organization which might be national or even international in scope. Chomsky also clarified that representative democracy, as in, say, the United States or Great Britain, would be criticized by an anarchist of his leanings on two grounds. First, because there is a monopoly of power centralized in the state. And second, because the representative democracy is limited to the political sphere and in no serious way encroaches on the economic sphere. Thus, Chomsky's, Kropotkin's, Bakunin's, and Pannekoek's liberated society doesn't reject a degree of representation, but it does reject political or economic entities that are divorced from and rule over the population. And that's true of participatory socialism as well. Chomsky added, anarchists of this tradition have always held that democratic controls of one's productive life is at the core of any serious human liberation. And he continued, as long as individuals are compelled to rent themselves on the market to those who are willing to hire them, as long as their role in production is simply that of ancillary tools, then there are striking elements of coercion and oppression that make talk of democracy very limited, if even meaningful. I think pretty much all anarchists, indeed almost all anti-capitalists of any type, would agree with Chomsky's sentiments so far, just as I do. However, for anyone serious about doing something to advance what they say they favor, a question should arise. That is, how does one organize an economy in accord with the need for, as Chomsky put it, self-management and direct worker control? Asked for an example, Chomsky replied, a good example of a really large-scale anarchist revolution is the Spanish Revolution of 1936. It was, he added, in many ways a very inspiring testimony to the ability of poor working people to organize and manage their own affairs extremely successfully, without coercion, without control. He acknowledged, however, that how relevant the Spanish experience is to an advanced industrial society one might question. For himself, Chomsky offered that self-management is precisely the rational mode for an advanced and complex industrial society, one in which workers can very well become masters of their own immediate affairs, that is, in direction and control of the shop, but also can be in position to make the major substantive decisions concerning the structure of the economy, concerning social institutions, concerning planning, regionally and beyond. But Chomsky also acknowledged that, At present, institutions do not permit workers to have control over the requisite information and the relevant training to understand these matters. And so again, to actually advance the favored conception, an obvious question should arise. That is, how does one structure an economy so it conveys what Chomsky calls the requisite information and relevant training essential for self-management? Asked to fill out his vision of anarchism, Chomsky replied, "Let me sketch what I think would be a rough consensus, and one that I think is essentially correct. Beginning with the two modes of organization and control," he said, namely organization and control in the workplace and in the community, one could imagine a network of workers' councils and, at a higher level, representation across the factories or across branches of industry or across crafts, and on to general assemblies of workers' councils that can be regional and national and international in charter. And from another point of view, he went on, one can project a system of government that involves local assemblies, again, federated regionally, dealing with regional issues, crossing crafts, industry, trades, and so on, and again at the level of the nation or beyond. I agree with Chomsky that his picture represents a rough consensus among anarchists, and rightly so in my view. It also describes participatory economics and participatory society, so to this point, there is still no problem or concern to address that diverges from the participatory approach. Chomsky continued, "An idea of anarchism is that delegation of authority is rather minimal, and that its participants at any one of these levels of government should be directly responsive to the organic community in which they live. In fact," he continued, "the optimal situation would be that participation in one of these levels of government should be temporary, and even during the period when it's taking place should be only partial. That is, the members of a workers' council who are for some period actually functioning to make decisions that other people don't have the time to make should also continue to do their work as part of the workplace or neighborhood community in which they belong." Again, for the participatory approach, this is not only unobjectionable, it is implemented in economic and political relations too, though we haven't as yet dealt with the latter in our episodes. Next, however, comes a point of possible concern. Chomsky said, "As for political parties, my feeling is that an anarchist society would not forcefully prevent political parties from arising." But then he went on, "In fact, anarchism has always been based on the idea that any system of norms that is imposed on social life will constrain and very much underestimate its energy and vitality, and that all sorts of new possibilities of voluntary organization may develop at that higher level of material and intellectual culture." The idea of no system of norms we will come back to. The minimal, not forcefully prevent formulation foreshadowed what follows, as he added, "But I think it is fair to say that insofar as political parties are felt to be necessary, anarchist organization of society will have failed." Why did Chomsky say that? Why would people forming a political party, you may reasonably wonder, be a sign of failure? Chomsky explained that it should be the case that where there is direct participation in self-management, in economic and in social affairs, then factions, conflicts, differences of interest, and ideas and opinions which should be welcomed and cultivated will be expressed at every level. I certainly agree with that. Indeed, the participatory approach, perhaps reflecting Chomsky's influence, sees such diversity as a prime virtue. But then Chomsky added, "Why differences should fall into 2, 3, or n political parties I don't quite see. I think that the complexity of human interest and life does not fall in that fashion. Parties represent basically class interest, and classes would have been eliminated or transcended in such a society." I, of course, agree regarding the elimination of parties as agents of class or other hierarchically arrayed group interests. But does that imply that the existence of parties would indicate failure? Chomsky was saying human preferences are so diverse that the only reason a considerable number of folks would share a set of views that are consistently contrary to those that other sets of people hold, thus providing reason for forming a party, would be if the folks were in a different class due to occupying a structurally different economic or perhaps social position, thus having opposed economic or social interests. In other words, a party would form only if a lot of folks had similar views to one another, rather different than the views of non-party members. And, Chomsky was saying, unless some roles in society created that clear-cut schism, why should it exist? With self-management, he wondered, why should roles lead to such groups? He may be right that that is the only basis on which a party would form, but I doubt it is so. For example, imagine a party forming around some new values that the participants are seeking to advocate and introduce into social life. Perhaps it is animal rights, as but one possible example, or even something about space travel. Or perhaps it is a new economic value, to equalize pleasure, say, which goes well beyond, for good or ill, the participatory aim of attaining equity. Or maybe the issue is abortion, or something to do with the rights of future generations compared to present populations. In such cases, perhaps people would form a party because they agreed on some of what they would feel to be highly important views, and they think other folks are wrong in not agreeing on those views, and they want to make their case in concert with one another. So why must such a constituency with an agenda be a class, or even any group within a hierarchy of power? Why couldn't it be that there is simply a group with a view that they deem very important, but that others differ from or haven't yet arrived at? However, as long as Chomsky said factions are welcome, as he did, I think the values underlying what Chomsky was saying and what I am amending it to are in accord. What I am calling a party is just a large faction in his view that crosses neighborhoods and workplaces and which, for some purposes, wants to coordinate their collective efforts on behalf of ideas they share. So if that is welcome, and I think Chomsky would say it is, then there is no real dispute, I think. If there is something lurking in Chomsky's interview contrary to the participatory logic we have advocated, we still haven't found it, except perhaps for the phrase, quote, any system of norms that is imposed on social life will constrain and very much underestimate its energy and vitality. Chomsky next indicated that he was unpersuaded that participation in governance is a full-time job. It may be full-time in an irrational society, Chomsky acknowledged, where all sorts of problems arise because of the irrational nature of institutions. But in a properly functioning advanced industrial society organized along libertarian lines, I would think, he said, that executing decisions taken by representative bodies is a part-time job, which should be rotated through the community, and furthermore should be undertaken by people who at all times continue to be participants in their own direct activity. As to how much time will have to go to governance, including adjudicating disputes, dealing with antisocial actions, determining legislation for steadily altering circumstances, and implementing collective projects, I have no idea. But I suspect it will be considerably more than Chomsky suggested. He was certainly right, however, that much, and likely even most of what current governments do will no longer be needed. He was also right, I think, that all people in all political functions, like for all other functions, must be well prepared to do their tasks well, and must be engaged in those tasks in ways and with responsibilities that do not elevate their power or wealth or their capacity to amass privilege either for themselves or for others, or to have a say over outcomes beyond what is appropriate for all actors. Of course, how to accomplish all this is the meat and potatoes of the assertion that it must be so. Put differently, saying it must be so makes no case, especially for anyone skeptical, that it can be so. It instead raises a question: how do we do it? Chomsky pinpointed a broad underlying insight, I think, when he said, it seems to me the natural suggestion is that governance should be organized industrially, as simply one of the branches of industry, with their own workers' councils and their own self-governance and their own participation in broader assemblies. Again, this is unobjectionable to an advocate of participatory economy, or, as we will see in coming episodes, participatory polity and participatory society, as long as we keep in mind that it applies to the part of government that generates products for consumption, and also that an airplane pilot, a steel worker, a doctor, or a governance worker all need to have appropriate skills and knowledge on the one hand, but also roles that give them no more overall power or privilege than any other citizen on the other hand. To put the problem another way, consider two industries: widget making. Widget is just a generic term for productive outputs that economists use. Widget making and governance. Workers' councils in both these industries would exist. Both councils would not have complete autonomy, but would instead be subject to a broader social plan that they, however, contribute to because their acts affect other people as well as other people's acts affecting them. Nevertheless, the external constraints on widget making, where widget is just a stand-in word economists often use to mean any product, are likely to be far less intrusive to how widget workers operate each day than the external constraints on governance intrude on how governance workers operate each day. For widget makers, society's interest is the number of widgets produced and the amount of resources to be used in their production, as well as that the workplace is classless, and beyond that, the workers' interests are essentially sovereign. But when you take a job like a police officer, as one example of a job in the political governmental sphere, which is what I think Chomsky is referring to with his term governance, then society's interests are not just enforce the law, which is far more complicated than produce 45 million widgets using this amount of inputs, but enforce the law in a way that protects and respects everyone's rights and doesn't give too much discretion, that is power, to police officers to rule over us. But even so, that difference is only a matter of degree. Thinking about airplane pilots or doctors reveals a need for similar types of socially determined guidelines and constraints as would be needed for governance, though unique to each case, even including widget making. On the other hand, when legislators generate a law, or when judges generate decisions, this is not really analogous to a workplace generating bicycles, say, or widgets. We will see that conceiving a participatory polity isn't just a simple matter of repeating all features of how a participatory economy addresses economic activity. Nonetheless, so far, we don't have new concerns from the left from Chomsky for participatory economics, or if you prefer the name participatory socialism, to address. So far, instead, Chomsky's sentiments were quite consistent with, and I suspect helped lead toward, the participatory economic approach. Responding to another question from his interviewer, however, Chomsky said, "In a decent society, everyone would have the opportunity to find interesting work, and each person would be permitted the fullest possible scope for his talents." One would certainly hope so, but then Chomsky asked, what more would be required in particular extrinsic reward in the form of wealth and power to elicit such work? Chomsky answered his own query, nothing more, unless we assume that applying one's talents in interesting and socially useful work is not rewarding in itself. And this is where problems for participatory economics to address start to surface. The assertion that an economy needs to provide no extrinsic reward to elicit work is false for three interconnected reasons. The first reason has to do with the need to correlate work and consumption, including having information and indicators which permit sensible correlated choices by all concerned. The second reason is that a central purpose for remuneration is not only to provide incentives, but to have just outcomes regarding both production and consumption. And finally, the third reason bears on the incentive issue itself, which was the only aspect Chomsky directly spoke to. The point of the third is someone saying that he or she likes to work, as Chomsky felt all would say in a desirable society, is not the same as that same person saying that work is the only thing he or she likes. And it turns out that this obvious and seemingly nitpicky distinction actually matters. By work we mean labor that is undertaken within the economic institutions of society to produce contributions to the social product which other people, not the producer or his or her family and friends, will enjoy. And Chomsky is of course right that there exist intrinsic reasons to do work for the social good, including self-expression and to benefit others. But what is missing is an obvious parallel truth, which is, as Ehrenreich emphasized during our last Vision episode, that there are also intrinsic reasons to want to have leisure too. Leisure not just to rest, but also to play, to relate to family and friends, and to do things that we like, but that we are not good enough to be doing as a way of making a contribution to society. As a result, if we are free to individually choose the amount of productive work in the economy we will do, and we are also free to choose the leisure that we will enjoy while not working, and if making a choice to do less work has zero bearing on our claims on social output as a consumer, which is what Chomsky's formulation suggests, then we may well choose to work less than society needs, or less than equity and justice warrant. In other words, if I get the income I want independent of the amount of work I do, then I may work less than my income calls for. To explain his contrary view that will not happen, Chomsky started out, there's a certain amount of work that just has to be done if we are to maintain a worthy standard of living. It's an open question how onerous that work has to be. That much is certainly correct, though it is important to realize that what a worthy standard of living from outputs of production isn't dictated by some natural law of nature. What constitutes a worthy living instead depends on society's productive potentials, but also on an active choice by people as to their relative desire for more outputs or for more free time. And it is also important to realize that quite a lot of work, for a very long time to come, will have to be demanding, and often even boring and tedious, and sometimes even dangerous. And that even more work than that, however positive it may be to do, will not be intrinsically more rewarding than spending the same period of time pursuing hobbies, or pursuing personal relations, or playing with family or friends, or reading, and so on. When Chomsky added, "Let's recall that science and technology and intellect have not been devoted to overcoming the onerous and self-destructive character of the necessary work of society," he is, of course, again correct. When he next added that the reason is that it has always been assumed that there is a substantial body of wage slaves who will do such work simply because otherwise they'll starve, Chomsky is again correct. And indeed, he was also correct when he said, if human intelligence is turned to the question of how to make the necessary work of the society itself meaningful, we don't know what the answer will be. True, too. But whatever direct attention will ultimately yield, it isn't going to happen in a week or a month or even a decade, and there will be limits, not least environmental, on how much onerous work can be replaced by more uplifting work. In any event, this raises another issue for a good economy, which is that it must facilitate sensible and warranted attention to matters bearing on improving the quality of work life, as well as bearing on the pleasure and potentials unleashed by the products of work life. This means it must provide information suitable for deciding those results, something we'll talk more about later. Chomsky continued, "My guess is that a fair amount of work can be made entirely tolerable." I would agree. But I would also say that there is a large gap between entirely tolerable on the one hand and as engaging and interesting as what we typically choose to do with leisure time on the other hand. And also that a fair amount is, as well, far short of all. Chomsky next said, "It's a mistake to think that even back-breaking physical labor is necessarily onerous. Many people, myself included, do it for relaxation." You may be wondering, what back-breaking work did Chomsky ever do? Is he making that up? Well, he actually liked to work in his yard, including digging, carrying, etc. So sure, but does anyone really do back-breaking physical labor day in and day out for relaxation? For fun? For edification, such that being totally free to do less of it, with no impact on their income, they would say they prefer no change? Not many, I would wager. Chomsky went on, "Recently, for example, I got it into my head to plant 34 trees in a meadow behind my house on the State Conservation Commission, which means I had to dig 34 holes in the sand. You know, for me, and what I do with my time mostly, that's pretty hard work. But I have to admit I enjoyed it. I wouldn't have enjoyed it if I'd had work norms, if I'd had an overseer, and if I'd been ordered to do it at a certain moment, and so on. I have to say, my guess is that he also wouldn't have enjoyed it quite so much if it was his job, day in and day out. He might have enjoyed it somewhat less, also, if it wasn't in his own backyard, and if, because he was working with a team, he had to abide a schedule. But mainly, whether Chomsky enjoyed it or not, the amount of time he would give to it simply to have the pleasure of the involvement could easily have been way less than the amount needed, or the amount others might have given to it. What if someone wanted to do back-breaking labor once every 5 or 10 months, or 5 or 10 years, and the rest of the time wanted to do only highly empowered conceptual labor of a creative sort? If that is okay, what if everyone opted for that? When Chomsky next said, on the other hand, if it's a task taken on just out of interest, fine, that can be done. He means that it will be enjoyable, as it was for him. True enough, but the implication seems to have been that we can all just do what we take up just out of interest, and somehow what we choose to do on grounds of just our interest will match up, regarding output, summed over everyone, with what everyone wants to consume. That formulation foreshadows a big operational, though not philosophical, divergence from participatory economics, one that we will have to address. The questioner then said, I put it to you that there may be a danger that this view of things is a rather romantic delusion, entertained only by a small elite of people who happen, like elite professors, perhaps journalists, and so on, to be in the very privileged situation of being paid to do what anyway they like to do. I think this was a fair question, and a gutsy one too, but it did miss additional points, including what is just and what is needed to convey necessary information. In any case, Chomsky answered, "That's why I began with a big if." I said, we first have to ask to what extent the necessary work of the society, namely the work which is required to maintain the standard of living that we want, needs to be onerous or undesirable. I think that the answer is much less than it is today, but let's assume there is some extent to which it remains onerous. Well, in that case, Chomsky continued, the answer is quite simple. That work has to be equally shared among people capable of doing it. Mining will remain onerous, so will many kinds of cleaning, among a great many other rote tasks, and, in truth, for example, even the finest, most creative chef on the planet is unlikely to want to cook other people's meals for more hours than needed to justify his own preferred level of consumption, much less clean the dishes. To share, do we each do an equal share of mining, cleaning, cooking, and every other onerous aspect of work? Of course not. So the point is that we would each, in Chomsky's formulation, share a fair amount of such onerous tasks along with our other more intrinsically fulfilling tasks. We would balance our jobs for onerousness, and I would agree that equilibrating each person's job for onerousness would by definition eliminate the issue of rewarding unequal onerousness from any economic calculus. There would be none to reward. In other words, paying attention to onerousness as a factor in determining income would become irrelevant to attaining just results, since onerousness would not vary from person to person. But, and now I am starting to differ with what Noam was saying, equilibrating onerousness of work does not address the full issue of incentives, indicators, or fairness, nor the impact of work on the division of actors into opposed classes. Staying close for the moment to the aspect that Chomsky was addressing, incentives are supposed to provide reason for people to work in a manner and for a duration that yields social output in accord with popular desires that are, in turn, mediated by knowledge of the implications of the chosen output level for work. Balancing output from work and what people desire for consumption requires information able to guide people in sensibly and responsibly deciding what to consume and what to produce. Fairness requires information and norms that ensure that the distribution of benefits and costs associated with both production and consumption, which is with both what we do and what we receive, and to some degree its impact on us, is equitable, whatever we decide we mean by that term. Continued good results requires having information that indicates where it makes sense to invest to improve work relations and generate new output, as well as to further other essential aims, such as classlessness. Chomsky went on to say, as I watch people work, automobile mechanics, for example, I think one often finds a good deal of pride in work. I think that kind of pride in complicated work well done, because it takes thought and intelligence to do it, especially when one is also involved in management of the enterprise, determination of how the work will be organized, what it is for, what the purposes of the work are, what will happen to it, and so on. I think all of this can be satisfying and rewarding activity, which in fact requires skills, the kind of skills people will enjoy exercising. I and the participatory approach agree that much of work, but far from all of it, has such attributes. But it is important to be clear that in a good economy, the fact that I would be involved in determining what the purposes and composition and timing of the work I do is not the same as saying that I alone would determine the purpose, composition, and timing. Instead, I would be part of a discussion on what we should do, but I might sometimes be on the losing end of a decision. As a good citizen, I should still feel socially responsible to do my tasks, but my internal incentives to do them would in that case likely be lower than if the decision had gone my way. In any event, even regarding engaging and intrinsically rewarding work, people will also want to spend time with their kids, enjoy hobbies, celebrate, contemplate, or whatever. Chomsky added, while still talking exclusively about the onerous work aspect, suppose it turns out that there is some residue of work which really no one wants to do, whatever that may be. Okay, then I say that residue of work must be equally shared, and beyond that, people will be free to exercise their talents as they see fit. In my view, as a guide to conceiving how a good economy might best work, this is ill thought through. First, many will not want to do work that is tedious and boring if not doing it would have no revealed adverse effects on oneself and others. Second, suppose after we agree on equilibrating jobs for onerousness, as Chomsky suggests, we also agree that in the fulfilling part of my job I am free to use my talents as I see fit, as Chomsky suggests. Well, I was once a fairly good tennis player. Nothing to write home about, but I loved playing. So suppose I decided, okay, that's the talent I want to exercise, choosing as I see fit in the hours left after I do my share of onerous work. I am just not so good at it that people would enjoy watching me. Chomsky may say no one will opt to do something that is not socially valuable to others. But consider, even if that was true, maybe I think people should enjoy watching me on a tennis court, or should learn to do so. Or, even if not, how does anyone know what is and what isn't socially valuable to others? In Chomsky's picture, what reveals that? More, how does anyone know that their effort or product isn't up to snuff? Perhaps Chomsky's answer would be, like mine, that the tennis industry has to hire new players or teachers, and wouldn't hire me. But in that case, I am not totally free to exercise my talents as I see fit, nor is anyone else. I cannot opt to do work, tennis, surgery, linguistics, or whatever, that is not up to snuff. I can only choose to do work within certain norms and social relations that prevent useless endeavors, including preventing me being an incompetent tennis player or an incompetent surgeon, and so on. But what are these norms and relations which yield good economic outcomes and which also help eliminate class division and help people exercise self-managing say? These are questions that one must address to give substance to the values of those favoring self-management, including Chomsky. But Chomsky instead confined himself only to concerns about onerousness of certain work. Pushed further by his questioner, Peter J., who doubted that the amount of tasks would be deemed intrinsically negative would be low, Chomsky replied, "Whatever it is, notice that we have two alternatives. One alternative is to have it equally shared. The other is to design social institutions so that some group of people will be simply compelled to do the work on pain of starvation. Those are the two alternatives." That observation is not entirely right, even ignoring other dimensions of work than onerousness. Rather, one could go a long way toward improving the quality of life effective work within ecological limits, time limits, allocation limits, etc. And one could refuse to compel a minority to do all that was left. And one could reject mechanically sharing it all equally as well. And one could then, as a third alternative, remunerate to offset the negative impact of the more onerous tasks. This would allow people to opt for more or less onerous work, as they opt to work longer or less long, or to receive more or less income for their total work. But there would be no starvation threat anywhere in the picture. Chomsky replied to the questioner, raising roughly the same point by saying, "I'm assuming everyone essentially gets equal remuneration." But then one wonders, why did he assume that, or even what the word essentially means? These may seem to be minor matters, but they are not. They are instead, once writ large into societal level implications, at the core of the justice and incentive side of the issue of how we define and remunerate work. So what if I'm happy to receive less income, which is less claim on social product, if my working fewer hours to get less income means that I can have more leisure? Can I then choose to take less income for working less hours because I want the extra leisure time? Or can I just work fewer hours to get more leisure but keep the same income? This is what Chomsky seems to be saying we can do, or else he is saying we are not free to enjoy more leisure. The first option of less work, less income, but more leisure, that the participatory approach welcomes, seems socially responsible. It maintains equity. The second option of less work, no change in income, and more leisure, that Chomsky's picture advocates, seems socially irresponsible. It violates equity. The first option seems to me economically viable. It allows output to match desires for output. The second option seems to me not viable. It causes output to fall way short of desires for output. Chomsky said, "A basic anarchist principle has long been that whenever possible, and when it doesn't conflict with the social good, we should enable people to pursue their own personal visions of the good life." I agree with that, so long as we are very careful about the social and not just personal good. But in any event, having a single income level and a single work time requirement for everyone is, in my view, an instance of an unnecessary and coercive requirement. There is no social reason why people should not be able to trade off income for leisure or vice versa. On the other hand, there is a social reason why people should not be able to lower their work time without lowering their income, and should not be able to raise their income without increasing their time or effort working. The social reason is the need for production to match consumption, and the benefits and costs to be shared fairly. Chomsky said, let's imagine three kinds of society. One, the current one, in which the undesired work is given to wage slaves. Let's imagine a second system, in which the undesired work, after the best efforts to make it meaningful, is shared. And let's imagine a third system, where the undesired work receives high extra pay, so that individuals voluntarily choose to do it. Well, it seems to me, Chomsky continued, that either of the two latter systems is consistent with, vaguely speaking, anarchist principles. But he continued, I would argue myself for the second rather than the third, but either of the two is quite remote from any present social organization or any tendency in contemporary social organization. I am not sure why Chomsky would argue for the second rather than the third. Saying that everyone gets the same income seems to me, as noted above, to be more of a constraint on personal choice and an unnecessary constraint than does permitting or acknowledging some differences in onerousness or duration in people's jobs and remunerating accordingly. But we are still not getting to the issue of hours worked matching up with output desired, nor to the issue of having indicators to inform intelligent decision-making. That is, to provide the information Chomsky rightly spoke of earlier that people need if they are to engage responsibly in economic life. And nor have we seriously broached the subject of consumption rights, and most of all, while noticing the duration of work and its onerousness, we haven't noticed that different kinds of work differently impact workers doing it in ways bearing on their ability to participate in decision-making. The questioner at this point asked, It seems to me that there is a fundamental choice, however one disguises it, between whether you organize work for the satisfaction it gives to the people who do it, or whether you organize it on the basis of the value of what is produced for the people who are going to use or consume what is produced. This polarized formulation misses that you can and must, if there is to be real self-management and solidarity, accomplish both these priorities at once, as in considering both the impact on workers and the impact on consumers too, and then deciding what and how much to produce and what and how much to consume. Saying that producers can do whatever they like with no input from consumers, and therefore simply imposing on consumers that they can have only what emerges from the totally independent choices of producers, or saying that consumers can have whatever they want with no input from producers, and therefore simply imposing on producers that they must do what is sought by totally independent choices of consumers, are equally one-sided and dysfunctional approaches. The questioner continued, A society that is organized on the basis of giving everybody the maximum opportunity to fulfill their hobbies, which is essentially the work for work's sake view, finds its logical culmination in a monastery, where the kind of work which is done, namely prayer, is work for the self-enrichment of the worker, and where nothing is produced which is of any use to anybody else, and you live either at a low standard of living or you actually starve. This goes too far, but it is again gutsy, I think, and the underlying point is real. What will connect work that is done purely because it is fulfilling to the level of outputs that consumers desire? Likewise, what will connect needs and desires for outputs to implications for workers producing these outputs? Chomsky replied, My feeling is that part of what makes work meaningful is that its products do have use. The work of the craftsman is in part meaningful to that craftsman because of the intelligence and skill that he puts into it, but also in part because the work is useful. The fact that the kind of work you do may lead to something else, that's very important, quite apart from the elegance and beauty of what you may achieve. And I think that covers every field of human endeavor. Of course, the above is true, but it is also not addressing the issue raised. Even though the observation is true, the issues remain operative unless one wants to claim that the pleasure of doing self-managed labor that contributes to social output is so great that everyone will automatically want to do an amount, in sum, consistent with what people want to consume, and unless one wants to additionally claim that people will know what that appropriate amount is, also automatically. Chomsky added, Furthermore, I think if we look at a good part of human history, we'll find that people to a substantial extent did get some degree of satisfaction, often a lot of satisfaction, from the productive and creative work that they were doing. I have my doubts about this assertion, except, of course, that some degree makes it true but irrelevant to the issue of too much or too little. Chomsky next said, I think work freely undertaken can be useful, meaningful work done well. Of course it can. But it can also produce stuff that no one wants, or that is too much of a good thing, or that is too little. The issue is what causes it to produce stuff people want in an amount that people want. Work can be fun or uplifting to do, like me playing tennis or me being a surgeon, say, but not of sufficient quality to be contributing. How does one know? And more, just because work can be meaningful and well done, especially if we create institutions that ensure that, this still doesn't mean we all, or perhaps even any of us, automatically want to do as much of it as our desires for outputs require. Chomsky said, "Also, you pose the dilemma that many people pose between desire for satisfaction in work and a desire to create things of value to the community. But it's not so obvious that there is any dilemma, any contradiction. If we police ourselves to do an appropriate amount of work and to seek an appropriate amount of consumption, which means if we have information that permits us to police ourselves, then perhaps Chomsky is right. But in the absence of that information, why can't I play tennis or be a surgeon as my work, even if I am not very good at these pursuits?" Chomsky emphasized a particular point about work having intrinsic rewards, and regarding that point, at least among anarchists and serious leftists of all types, I believe he was pushing on an open door. We all agree. He said, "Recall that a person has an occupation, and it seems to me that most of the occupations that exist, especially the ones that involve what are called services, that is, relations to human beings, have an intrinsic satisfaction and reward associated with them, namely in the dealings with the human beings that are involved. That's true of teaching, and it's true of ice cream vending. I agree that ice cream vending doesn't require the commitment or intelligence that teaching does, and maybe for that reason it will be less desired occupation. But if so, it will have to be shared. So what we have now emerging is a list of less desired jobs, and those will have to be shared, as people also do desired things that they want to do to intrinsically fulfill themselves for enough duration to fill out a responsible job. Of course, we also need some way to ensure that people aren't doing things that they want to do, but that they are not good enough at to produce a worthwhile output. Here is the crux of it, though. Chomsky said, "What I'm saying is that our characteristic assumption that pleasure in work, pride in work, is either unrelated to or negatively related to the value of the output is related to a particular stage of social history, namely capitalism, in which human beings are tools of production." Chomsky continued, "It is by no means necessarily true. For example, if you look at the many interviews with workers on assembly lines that have been done by industrial psychologists, you find that one of the things they complain about over and over again is the fact that their work simply can't be done well, the fact that the assembly line goes through so fast that they can't do their work properly. That producing vehicles in a self-managed workplace will be vastly better than in a capitalist one is true. That one will not want to do it to the complete exclusion of leisure, however, is also true. And the idea that all future work, because it benefits society and because it is self-managed, will be intrinsically fulfilling to the same degree as all other work is also obviously false. Such differences may matter, and duration will certainly matter." Then Chomsky says something quite important, and in my view a bit different. "But let's imagine still that at some level it does harm. Well, okay, at that point, he says, the society, the community, has to decide how to make compromises. Each individual is both a producer and a consumer, after all, and that means that each individual has to join in these socially determined compromises, if in fact there are compromises to be made." Exactly. But this means that there must be institutions that facilitate such decisions, and that we have to have some kind of norms as well to know what is fair, what is just, what is consistent with preserving classlessness in our future economy. Chomsky, of course, knew all this, and so he said, "It seems to me that anarchist structures based on systems of workers' councils and federations provide exactly the set of levels of decision-making at which decisions can be made about a national plan. Similarly, state socialist societies also provide a level of decision-making, let's say the nation, in which national plans can be produced. There's no difference in that respect. The difference has to do with participation in those decisions and control over those decisions." In the case of central planning and authoritarian states, Chomsky might have added that decisions are top-down. In the anarchist alternative, Chomsky might have noted they are self-managing, which I will add, if it means anything coherent, means that we strive to have people involved in them to the extent they are affected by them. But in that case, we need institutions and associated information flow that permits, facilitates, and even makes that the result. As Chomsky said, in the view of anarchists, those decisions are made by the informed working class through their assemblies and their direct representatives who live among them and work among them. This is unobjectionable, but it leaves the question, how is it that the workers, and as mentioned earlier, also the consumers, are informed? From where do they get the information essential to the decisions? And as well, by what methods do they tally their preferences into decisions that they all then abide? Not to mention, what ensures that they are prepared and willing to wisely use the information to help make the decisions? Asking these questions on top of Chomsky's sentiments is not asking for a blueprint that goes into unknowable details. It is instead asking only for a minimal structural description that can give real substance and believability to the possibility of self-management. Chomsky continues, certainly in any complex industrial society there should be a group of technicians whose task it is to produce plans and to lay out the consequences of decisions, to explain to the people who have to make the decisions that if you decide this, you're likely to get this consequence, because that's what your programming model shows, and so on. But the point, he continues, is that those planning systems are themselves industries, and they will have their workers' councils, and they will be part of the whole council system, and the distinction is that these planning systems do not make decisions. They produce plans in exactly the same way that automakers produce autos. The plans are then available for the workers' councils and council assemblies in the same way that autos are available to ride in. This, too, raises important questions. What keeps those planners and other experts from dominating outcomes? It is one thing to provide expertise in assembling information. It is another thing to have power over outcomes. How do we get the former but without conveying the latter? Lacking an answer to this and related questions would cast doubt on the entire undertaking. And for that matter, if workers are relating to plans the way a consumer relates to an automobile, they are accepting them whole hog. How is that involving them in planning? How is that giving them a decision-making say in proportion to the degree they're affected? Chomsky was saying that there is no intrinsic difference in the work of the planners, and by extension of other experts of various sorts, as compared to more rote and repetitive work, sufficient to cause us to have to think through its implications and even amend our approach to allocating such work in order to avoid problems. That is quite contrary to the participatory approach. For example, imagine we are looking at a new society. Imagine we see lots of workplaces. Some of them contain just Chomsky's planners. Others contain just various experts, such as doctors, engineers, whatever. Then let's say 8 out of every 10 contain folks doing overwhelmingly rote and repetitive labor, or at any rate tasks that don't empower them. We aren't looking at degrees of onerousness, but at the degrees to which different tasks and jobs impact workers' skills, knowledge, confidence, and so on. Now, do you think that the planners, an expert 20%, who Chomsky says will have the responsibility of explaining implications to the rest so that all together can decide, are going to be okay with having no greater say and also no greater reward than the 80% they are instructing? And do you think the 80% who are disempowered by their daily tasks are going to be prepared and even inclined to equally decide society's outcomes? Returning to what Chomsky was explicitly addressing, from the above issue that he didn't explicitly address, on what basis do workers determine what to favor? Where is the opinion and influence of consumers in the process? How is it conveyed? More, why does anyone abide by emergent plans, where abiding would of course entail working specific numbers of hours, at times and in ways that one might not optimally prefer? There is a very real sense in which the economic vision called participatory economics, or PARECON, was conceived precisely to answer all the questions that I have raised earlier about Chomsky's anarchist vision. The interview with the young Chomsky was done in 1976, and the conception and formulation of participatory economics began in earnest not long thereafter. How do we give institutional substance to an anarchist or libertarian, classless, and self-managing vision for economy? The answers that emerged for Hernell and myself bear directly upon all the points raised earlier, and some very important additional ones. First, participatory economics, moved by the call for self-management, settled on workers' and consumers' councils as the venues of decision-making. This is where people get together, air views, discuss opinions, manifest preferences, and settle on decisions. This accords with Chomsky's picture. This commitment was also just borrowing from past practice. The norm guiding the councils in participatory economics, however, was conceived so as to conduct discussions, debates, and explorations, and then tally preferences, all to convey to each actor a say in decision-making in proportion as they are affected, at least to the extent possible and without being overly picayune about it. This latter refined past practice somewhat, but it was quite consistent with Chomsky's sentiments in his interview. Second, there arose a concern about the distribution of tasks among all those able to do work. How should tasks be combined into jobs? While the issue of more or less onerous or more or less fulfilling arose for Chomsky, for Haenel and I, in accord with Chomsky's observation of the need for workers to be prepared to participate in and make decisions, it became clear that some kinds of work are empowering for those doing it, and other kinds are disempowering for those doing it, and that this difference is actually much more basic and societally impactful than that there are more onerous versus less onerous tasks. Empowering tasks produce not only goods and services, but also, in the workers involved, increased confidence, enhanced skills, socially enriched connections, enlarged awareness of critical information, and enhanced experience of daily decision-making. Disempowering tasks, in contrast, produce not only goods and services, but also, in the workers involved, diminished confidence, reduced skills, fragmentation, impoverished awareness of critical information, and enforced divorce from daily decision-making. Combining overwhelmingly empowering tasks into roughly 20% of all jobs, and combining overwhelmingly disempowering tasks into roughly 80% of all jobs, which is the mode of the familiar corporate division of labor, in turn guarantees that the 20% who are empowered, and who we call the coordinator class, will rule over the 80% who are disempowered, which we call the working class. From this observation, the participatory approach sees the need to replace corporate division of labor with what we call balanced job complexes. The idea is trivially simple. Where Chomsky talked about balancing jobs for onerousness, we felt that instead the real balance needed is for empowerment effects. Differences in onerousness can be offset justly and fairly, and without additional repercussions, by differences in income earned. If you have a more onerous job, you earn more. If you have a less onerous job, you earn less. But differences in empowerment effects aren't mainly a matter of discomfort. They are, instead, a matter of lasting implications for preferences and capacities and for class relations. So the advisory that emerged for Haenel and I was that we should all do a job complex with a mix of tasks and responsibilities which, on average, over time, has the same empowerment impact as each other job in the economy. Of course, balancing for empowerment also largely balances for onerousness and intrinsic desirability of jobs, but not entirely, and in any event, that isn't its purpose. Rather, the purpose was to avoid a class division between empowered employees, who we call a coordinator class, and disempowered employees, who we call a working class. And to our thinking, this empowerment balance was the most important step to take to avoid class division and all the ugly derivative effects it entails. Slight differences in onerousness could easily be addressed by differential income allotments to offset the debits onerousness imposes, as Chomsky acknowledged earlier. But a corporate division of labor imposes severe empowerment differences, leading to a class hierarchy, which would certainly subvert self-management. This was really a difference due to an absence. Chomsky's anarchist vision ignored the work and empowerment question, whereas the participatory approach highlighted it to be a central concern. But what about remuneration and consumption? Well, partly reiterating from earlier, here lies a key point of disagreement with the formulations in Chomsky's interview. The first problem to address in thinking about remuneration and consumption is the need for fairness. A second problem is the need for people to have incentives to do that which they should do, but would, assessing only their own condition, without incentives, prefer not to do. A third problem is the need to have signals that communicate needed information for wise and ethically sound decision-making about what to produce and consume. And a fourth problem is the need to correlate the population's desires for social product to the population's desires for work and also to enjoyed leisure. A frequent anarchist answer, and one that Chomsky also often intoned, and that was implicit, I think, in the interview, leading to my feeling that it harbored a problem, is okay, let's have work from each able-bodied person in accord with their abilities, and let's have consumption by each able-bodied person in accord with their needs. The trouble with this is, no one who says it literally means it. That is, no one means that they favor that each person decides, independently of all other people, and consulting only their own preferences, how much to take from the social product for their own consumption, as well as how long to work and what to work at. Taken literally, the from each to each norm is remarkably antisocial, so it is not intended literally. Consider that if I have only my own taste to consult, I will want a whole lot of stuff. Why not want it? Why not take it? Assuming there is no injustice involved and no loss to others, it is what the guideline tells me to do. And I will also only want to work up to the point at which the pleasures of working are outweighed by the pleasures to be had from leisure. Why not? It's what the guideline tells me to do. In other words, I will want too much, actually, very likely way too much. And despite Chomsky's correct insights into the intrinsic values of work, I will also very likely want to work far fewer hours than would be required to fulfill everyone expressing consumption needs like mine. So there is a problem. The mesh between work and consumption, not to mention taking into account the full social and environmental costs of both production and consumption. How do I do that without information that reveals those costs? The anarchist task is to solve these matters without defaming or degrading work or leisure, without violating self-management, and without imposing class division. It can be done, I believe, and as Revolution Z has described in previous episodes, by combining a self-managed network of councils and balanced job complexes of the sort Chomsky proposed with two additional structures: remuneration for duration, intensity, and onerousness of the socially valued work we do, called equitable remuneration, and cooperative negotiation of production and consumption by those same councils using procedures that account for full social costs and benefits and that convey to each actor a self-managing say via an allocation methodology called participatory planning. The remunerative scheme is fair. If we all do socially valued labor, which in time has had the onerous components minimized, but even until then, and we all do it for the same duration, and we all do it working equally hard, and all having an equal share of fulfilling and onerous tasks, then we should all earn an average income. But you can then get more income, if you wish, by working longer, harder, or at more onerous tasks, all in agreement with your workmates, and all in a socially productive manner. Alternatively, you might value leisure more and therefore opt for less consumption and thus also less work hours spent at socially valued labor, again in agreement with your workmates. Both choices are fair in the participatory view. And the system is not only fair, it also provides precisely the incentives needed to coordinate work with desires for the output of work. More subtly, but no less important, it provides precisely the information needed for people to sensibly determine investment patterns, volumes of production, etc. These are all matters dealt with in earlier episodes. The participatory planning allocation procedures are consistent with self-management, classlessness, and equity. They elevate human need and well-being, both in work and in leisure, to the touchstone of economic decisions. They make it part and parcel of personal fulfillment for people to take into account all social and environmental effects. Finally, I would like to reiterate that I have here addressed the young Chomsky's interview for 3 reasons. 1, I wanted to bring it to light for people who have likely never seen it. 2, I wanted to demonstrate that while the motives and values guiding Chomsky's formulations, and guiding anarchist formulations more generally, are in tune with participatory economy's aspirations, a few of the extrapolations to judgments about institutions are not. And 3, I wanted to make a case that participatory economics is in tune with the anarchist aspirations, but also accurately addresses the actual complexities of economic life. My hope is that a future discussion with an anarchist who has doubts about participatory economics, as enunciated shortly below, familiar to me from many reviews, critiques, and also chats with Chomsky, might go something like this. Anarchist. Liking much about participatory economics, there is still a key point that worries me. How do Parecon's advocates see work? Pareconist. By work, Pareconists mean activity undertaken in the economy to produce goods or services that others, not the person doing the work, will enjoy. Anarchist. But in a participatory society, this is self-managed, yes? Pareconist. Yes, absolutely. Anarchist. So isn't work, in that case, one of the cornerstone ways that a person expresses and fulfills him or herself? Pareconist. Again, yes, so long as it is self-managed, and so long as it is without class rule, and so long as it is without impositions perverting it, of course. Anarchist. Then why give an income for doing self-managed, socially valued labor? Doesn't remunerating work assume that without pay, people would rather vegetate than work? Why not get from each according to ability and give to each according to need? Pareconist. For one thing, while work that is freely undertaken to create worthy outputs is indeed part of a fulfilling life, nonetheless, certain aspects of work are boring and burdensome, causing us to want to do less. But more, so is taking care of kids part of a fulfilling life, or resting, or playing games, or reading, or going to a concert or a movie, or taking a walk, or learning something new. In other words, many activities that are not about producing something which others benefit from are also fulfilling. So we each have a trade-off, if you will, between work for the social good and leisure that we put to other desirable ends. Anarchist. Why can't we each decide how much leisure and work we want? Why do you assume that we will work too little or consume too much? Periconist. We should each decide. I agree with you, but not in isolation from the implications for people who produce what we consume or who consume what we produce, or for the environment for that matter. Anarchist. I agree, and that's why if I want to work less, I should take correspondingly less, and I will. Periconist. But how do you know how much it is just and fair to take or to work? The assumption of your norm from each to each is that people will be responsible. There will, of course, be many more things you would like to have than you will take, but you will responsibly restrain yourself. There will, of course, be times you would rather not work, but you will anyhow, to be responsible. Let's just assume, which most would doubt, that all people will automatically want to act thusly and not have their self-interest cloud their assessments. Still, the question arises, in actual practice, how will such people be responsible? According to what shared value system? And especially with what indicators to guide their choices? Anarchist. So you need remuneration for duration, intensity, and onerousness to get fair results, not only as an incentive? Periconist. Yes, exactly. And there is another issue, too. By having income as we do in participatory economics, the allocation system is not only able to be fair, but it is also able to unearth desires for leisure versus desires for output. It reveals as well different types of work that people prefer or dislike, as well as the relative desires for and costs of different types of production. This is information we need so that we can set current plans and investments accordingly. People restraining themselves to try and be responsible is, ironically, actually not so helpful. It is better for an economy if people reveal their actual true and full desires. These can usefully inform investment choices regarding where to aim in the future, even if for now people wind up agreeing to settle for less. Anarchist. I still feel like I would rather not besmirch what labor is and what we think are people's motives by offering rewards. Periconist. I don't see why fair allocation with self-management so that work's character and average duration is mutually agreed is besmirching it. But since you do feel that way, perhaps another observation might bridge our gap. Say we establish a participatory economy. That's a big if. But let's say that we get together the movements, the struggles, the patience, the hard work, and we do it. Say we establish a participatory economy. Difficult, but certainly not impossible, and our aim. If I am right, it would be disastrous to have no remunerative norm other than that people work and take whatever they independently choose to do and to have. So as a caution, to avoid risk of destructive outcomes, how about if we start with the participatory norm? Then over time, as people become more and more social, we experiment with having additional free goods and with more lenient accountings of duration, intensity, and onerousness in various workplaces or industries. And we see what happens. If you are correct, outcomes won't change, or they will even improve. In that case, we continue and enlarge the experiments. If I am right, outcomes will get seriously messed up. For want of guiding indicators, and many problems will arise. In that case, we slow or stop the experiment. By this approach, we minimize risks of calamity, but we also preserve and explore possibilities to further refine the income norm. We've said a lot in this podcast about the young Chomsky's views, about anarchist views, about participatory socialism and participatory economics. Undoubtedly, some folks listening will take issue with some aspects of the episode. If so, I hope you will append comments to that effect. I will certainly reply. I also hope you will consider visiting www.patreon.com/revolutionz, where you can register some support for this podcast. Listening is free, but quite a bit more support is needed to get us to a sensible budget, much less to provide means for us to grow and enrich Revolution Z. That said, this is Michael Albert, signing off until next time for Revolution Z.